are these people?
Yeah, Uganda is now officially anti-gay. As funny enough, we're talking about this, and tomorrow starts Pride Month at that. So I think it's definitely appropriate. But so President Museveni signed this bill. We did talk about this with JB last month, so I forgot to link that video in the subscription.
find
I'll
that
do
while you're
that after
talking.
that. But we kind of talked about this in terms of the possibility at that time. And now it's official. So he signed it into law on Monday, and our friend of the show, there were several articles on this, but I pulled this guy. We haven't used his stuff for a while. Shout out to Brett, friend of the show. We've had him on before. But he wrote this up where he writes, Ugandan leader ripped for grave assault on human rights after signing Kill the Gays bill. This is a desperate dark day for LGBTI rights and for Uganda, said Amnesty International Deputy Regional Director for East and Southern Africa. So Brett continues. Human rights defenders around the world on Monday condemned Ugandan President Yoweri Museveni after he signed a bill criminalizing same-sex sexual acts between consenting adults and imposing the death penalty for aggravated homosexuality. Museveni, who is 78 and has ruled the African nation for nearly 4 decades, signed the anti-homosexuality bill of 2023, under which people convicted of aggravated homosexuality, that is, same-sex sexual acts by HIV-positive people or with children, disabled people, or anyone deemed vulnerable, can be hanged to death. The law punishes same-sex acts with life imprisonment and attempted same-sex acts with 10 years behind bars. It also criminalizes the promotion of LGBTQ+ rights. The bill was initially rejected by Museveni last month because he wanted it amended to include a rehabilitation option for LGBTQ.
Yep.
Thank you. For LGBTQ+ people who would like to live normal lives again, according to a presidential spokesperson. The legislation builds on a 2013 law under which life imprisonment was the most severe penalty for same-sex relations. Museveni has said that he finds gay people disgusting. So we're going to play a clip where he says that. Very brief.
I'm still looking for this JB thing.
Okay.
But yeah, go ahead.
Western human rights groups, to President Obama,
respect,
to lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people.
Respect African societies and their values. If you don't agree, you just keep quiet. Let's manage our society the way we see. If we are wrong, we shall find out by ourselves. Just the way we don't interfere with yours.
Do you personally dislike homosexuals?
Of course, they are disgusting. What sort of people are they? How can you go? I never knew what they were doing. That's how I've been told recently that what they do is terrible, disgusting. But I was ready to ignore that if there was proof that that's how he's born, abnormal. But now the proof is not there.
Yeah. So it's hard to hear that. You know, as I said, you know, I lived in the country for a bit. I love the people there. Not a fan of their government or him, and I've made that very clear to Ugandans there. So shout out to my Ugandan family, but you know how I feel about Museveni. Like, give you much respect if you like him, but I can't. So anyway, we will continue. If you flip the screen.
There you go. I found the JB stream as well.
Despite our concerted efforts to stop the passage of the anti-homosexuality bill, the president today has legalized state-sponsored homophobia and transphobia by signing this bill into law. Frank Mugisha, executive director of the advocacy group Sexual Minorities Uganda, said in a statement, "It will erode the rights of LGBTQI LGBTQ individuals and put innocent Ugandans at crosshairs of grave violations from state and non-state actors, Mugisha added. We now look forward to the legal challenge in court and the law being repealed. Hours after Museveni signed the bill into law, 11 opponents, including Ugandan parliamentary lawmaker Fox Odoi Omelowo,
Yellow.
Yeah. Petitioned the Constitutional Court seeking to block its implementation, the Monitor reports. Amnesty International Deputy Regional Director for East and Southern Africa, Flavia Wangoa, I'm sorry, I'm butchering these names, said in a statement that this is a desperately dark day for LGBTI rights and for Uganda. The signing of this deeply repressive law is a grave assault on human rights and on the Constitution of Uganda and the regional and international human rights instruments to which Uganda is a part, she continued. The Anti-Homosexuality Bill of 2023 will do nothing other than enshrine discrimination, hatred, and prejudice against LGBTI Ugandans and their allies into law, Lugwanoa added. It's unconscionable that they risk losing their lives, their freedom, their privacy, their freedom of expression, and their ability to live free from discrimination. So this is a tweet from United Nations Human Rights. We are appalled that the draconian and discriminatory anti-gay bill is now law. It is a recipe for systematic violations of the rights of LGBT people and the wider population. It conflicts with the Constitution and international treaties and requires urgent judicial review.
Oh, fuck. I can't believe you've done this.
Like, that's pretty much what they're saying.
Yeah. Joseph Borrell, the European Union's High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, called a new law contrary to international human rights law and to Uganda's obligations under the African Charter of Human and People's Rights, including commitments on dignity and non-discrimination and the prohibition of cruel, inhumane, or degrading punishment. In the United States, which gives Uganda about $1 billion in annual assistance, President Joe Biden said in a statement that the enactment of Uganda's Anti-Homosexuality Act is a tragic violation of universal human rights. I join with people around the world, including many in Uganda, in calling for its immediate repeal, Biden continued. No one should have to live in constant fear for their life or being subjected to violence and discrimination. It is wrong.
Come on, man.
So Biden gave a statement, and surprisingly to many, but not surprising to me, Ted Cruz, yes, the Ted Cruz, actually sent a tweet. Wait, did I pass it? Actually, no, I didn't get to that yet. So sorry. But we'll get there anyhow. This shameful act is the latest development in an alarming trend of human rights abuses and corruption in Uganda, Biden asserted, adding that his administration is considering sanctions and restriction of entry into the United States against anyone involved in serious human rights abuses or corruption. Ugandan parliamentary speaker Annette Among said her U.S. visa had been revoked. Even some congressional Republicans, some of whom back anti-LGBTQ plus legislation in the United States, condemned the new Ugandan law, including Senator Ted Cruz of Texas, who called it grotesque and an abomination. So he writes, this Uganda law is horrific and wrong. Any law criminalizing homosexuality or opposing the death penalty for aggravated homosexuality is grotesque and an abomination. All civilized nations should join together in condemning this human rights abuse.
Oh, I see why he got it.
Why?
Well, if I were to take a guess, this last sentence here means we need to be the world police and go deal with this.
Right. So yeah, so notice how Biden said sanctions. So we will
Right.
get to that. We will get to that. Don't worry. But from a personal level, this does make sense that Ted Cruz said this, because I believe, and correct me in the chat if I'm wrong, that he has at least 2 daughters,
Yes.
I believe.
One which I
but one
know of is,
is
LGBTQ.
bisexual and a
Yeah.
teen. So obviously for Ted, this would be a personal issue for him. So I can understand, because people are like, why would Ted Cruz said that? Because has been against, he's been pro like anti-gay stuff in the past. One of his daughters came out as bi, and so I'm sure he's kind of taken a huge step back from that in life, his own daughters, which kind of proves for like politicians are not entitled to do shit unless it affects them personally. So
yeah.
So,
which this doesn't affect him impersonally, but personally enough,
Well, personally enough in terms of the implications of what this means for like his daughter, but not personally in terms of these are people of color in another country. So yes, you're right. But we are going to get to the sanctions part, because we talked about this with JB. We're going to talk about it again
and
in another way.
He called it too.
Yes.
As well as Zimbabwe, but yes.
But anyway, Brett continues. Same-sex sexual acts were already illegal in Uganda, one of around 30 African and 60 world nations that criminalize such acts under the 2013 law and legislation passed during colonization by Britain. Prior to colonization's imported homophobia, Uganda had a history of tolerated sexual diversity, including among the Baganda, the country's largest ethnic group, and Lango, who recognize a third gender, the Mukuto Dago. King Mwanga II, who ruled the Baganda people in the 1880s, was famously bisexual. Right-wing evangelical Christians from the United States have played a key role in the introduction of anti-LGBTQ+ legislation in African nations. Yeah, this is my last one. Attacks on LGBTQ+ rights and people, including the murders of activists including David Kato and Brian Wasswa, have increased in Uganda this century. Mugisha said that the new law will bring a lot of harm to Uganda's already persecuted LGBTQ+ community. We feel so worried, he told Annonce France Press. So what I'm going to play now. So if you go back, found this on Twitter. So I believe this is from African Rights, I believe. So as we try to get some voices from the ground, and so this is kind of my part in kind of hearing what Africans who live in or near Uganda think of this. So you got to hear what they have to say.
Cool.
This is bad news. It's not just for queer Ugandans, but for queer people across the African continent.
In our country, we will have our morals. We will protect our children. And we are making this law. We are making this law for ourselves. We are making this law for our children. We are making this law for the children of our children.
To reduce any kind of human being, irrespective of their sexuality, to a death sentence based on who they identify as and how they choose to live their lives, is something that we should all feel very ashamed about as a continent.
So if we don't stand our ground as a country, as a people, as a community, then we will completely have seceded our sovereignty and independence as a country.
The President, in principle, congratulated the members of Parliament on 2 fronts. One, for the strong stand on the anti-homosexuality bill, and 2, for rejecting pressure from the imperialists.
Senseless killing, honestly, I'd rather they invested that time in finding criminals and whatnot instead of like making a decision like God, on a God level, on some, because you're this way and I'm this way and you don't conform to my way, you're gonna die.
With regards to the news today from Uganda, personally, I find it incredibly disappointing, but I am not surprised that this is happening. It has been a work in progress for a very long time. And when you look at the history of Uganda and how this bill has surfaced and resurfaced on multiple levels, it was just a matter of time.
Yep. I mean, this is Dr. Nick's right. This is bad news for people in general, because here's what happens. Once the goobers in gooberment realize that they can do it to the weakest, and they'll roll that out to the rest of society incrementally.
Yeah, it's funny that Biden is calling Uganda out when people within the community really, yeah, they have more rights here, but even right now, those are being taken away as well. And I would argue that if you are LGBT in this country, it's not exactly safe for you either. It's not perfect here either. So yeah, it's just funny that he calls out Museveni for this, but check your own house, because you have issues in regards to LGBTQ rights. And once upon a time, you are
you've seen there's a television series that Stephen Fry put on about anti-gay stuff in general, right? And I'm pretty sure he went to Uganda and talked to like the radio DJ that's famous for being anti-gay pastor there, and talked to a woman with an incredible story about her abuse and stuff with that and things like that. It was really good. If people haven't watched it, they should. I should show it to you after the show ends, at least that episode.
But yeah, so we had this discussion with JB regarding how a lot of this anti-gay sentiment in African countries, Uganda in particular, comes from the West. Surprise, not surprise. I found this article. Now, eat this article with a grain of salt, because it is interesting. A lot of the stuff that has been said here, I haven't necessarily heard of, or I just want to kind of go a little deeper into this in terms of seeing if what Leah Buckle, this article is from Stonewall, which is based in the UK, wrote. But it does make some connections to what we discussed with JB a month ago in terms of, once upon a time. I wouldn't say that Africa as a whole was like, you cannot be gay, whatever, but there was, you can argue, a freedom of expression in terms of gender, or at least more fluid thinking in terms of thinking of gender and sexuality until colonization came into the mix and totally eradicated that. And like I said, all articles that we use in the show, you'll find them in the description if you want to read them for yourself, especially if we don't read all the articles entirely. I'm going to read most of this, though, because I think it does make for interesting, some interesting context to how Africa used to be, according to her. So this article, African Sexuality and the Legacy of Imported Homophobia, and Leah writes, dope. Thank you. In June, and I believe this article was written in the fall of 2020, just to give some context there. In June, Botswana overturned colonial-era laws which criminalized homosexuality, with the judge, Michael Labru, declaring that the anti-sodomy laws are British import and were developed without the consultation of local peoples. Sound familiar?
Yep.
If this was viewed as a massive success and a historical moment across the continent, despite this, the more than half of the countries in Africa outlaw sexual homosexuality, with 4 enforcing the death penalty. Now Uganda is one of them. At a time where we see more and more countries worldwide becoming progressive with regards to LGBT rights, why does Africa still maintain their anti-LGBT stance? Is homosexuality, rather than homophobia, a Western import, as claimed by Ugandan President Yoweri Museveni? Of course not. There is a direct correlation between the countries which belong to the Commonwealth and therefore have previously been under British rule, and countries that still have homophobic, biphobic, and/or transphobic legislature in their constitutions. 25% of the world's population, 2.4 billion people, currently live in a country belonging to the Commonwealth. However, they make up a disproportionate large 50% of countries that still criminalize homosexuality. But this phenomenon is specific to those under British rule. By the 13th century in France, punishments for male homosexuality include castration for the first offense. But the French repealed their anti-sodomy laws after the First French Revolution in 1750, 2 centuries prior to the British in 1967. This is then echoed in La Francophonie nations. Out of 54 member states, only 33% of these criminalize homosexuality, in comparison to 66% of Commonwealth nations. Prior to European colonization throughout the African continent, we see far different, more relaxed attitudes towards sexual orientation and gender identity. As far back as 2400 BC, tombs have been excavated in ancient Egypt with 2 men's bodies, Neakum and Kununhotep, pronunciation, sorry, embracing each other as lovers. In addition to their acceptance of same-sex relationships, ancient Egyptians, similar to other civilizations at the time, not only acknowledged a third gender, but venerated it. Many deities were portrayed androgynously, and goddesses such as Mut, the goddess of motherhood, literal translation mother, as Sekhmet, goddess of war, are often depicted as women with erect penises. This was not unique to Egypt or this time period. In the 16th century, the Imbala people of Angola had men in women's apparel with whom they kept amongst their wives. In contrast, King Henry VIII had just signed the Buggery Act in 1533 in England, which criminalized sex between 2 males. The last men to be sentenced to death by hanging in England were in 1835 for engaging in homosexual sex, whilst at the same time there was an openly gay monarch, King Muganda II of Buganda, present-day Uganda, who actively opposed Christianity and colonialism. The Igbo and Yoruba tribes, mostly found in present-day Nigeria, those are my tribes, shout out, did not have a binary of genders and typically did not assign gender to babies at birth and instead waited until later life. Similarly, the Dagaba people, present-day Ghana, assign gender not based on one's anatomy, but rather the energy one presents. In the royal palaces of northern Sudan, daughters were sometimes given slave girls for sex. For centuries across the African continent, there was a completely different attitude towards sexual and gender identities. Many African countries did not see gender as a binary in the way that their European colonizers did, nor did they correlate anatomy to gender identity. In no African country prior to colonization do we see any persecution of LGBT individuals because of their sexuality, nor any anti-LGBT laws. So how, despite a very relaxed attitude towards homosexuality and gender fluidity, for almost all of its recorded history, has Africa become one of the most difficult continents to be LGBT? Colonization and the spread of fundamentalist Christian attitudes from the British meant that much of Africa lost its previous cultural attitude towards sexual orientation and gender identity and were forced to adopt new values from British colonizers in the 19th and 20th centuries. Homophobia was legally enforced by colonial administrators and Christian missionaries. In 1910, Christians made up about 9% of the population of sub-Saharan Africa, By 2010, the figure had leapt to 63%. Anti-LGBT laws were not only written into constitutions, but also into the minds of many African people, and after the passing of several generations, this has become dogma. While many of the countries... Yes, I have, actually. While the majority of the countries under British rule are now independent, the majority who still criminalize homosexuality, including Jamaica and Uganda, have carried over these laws from the colonial era. Generations later, many Africans now believe that an anti-gay attitude is one that is part of their culture. So much so that former Zimbabwean President Mugabe labeled homosexuality as a white disease. The association of homosexuality as something Western is echoed throughout the ex-Commonwealth and particularly in African and Caribbean nations. For many who had their lives and cultures stripped from them by the British, Westernness is to be treated with suspicion and is essential to hold on to any part of themselves and their culture they can. This, combined with the fact that Western countries have threatened to deny aid to these countries unless they conform to their ideals, has hindered the fight for LGBT rights in African countries. For instance, when ex-Prime Minister David Cameron threatened to withdraw aid from Uganda as they were not adhering to proper human rights, the president advisor responded with, "But this kind of ex-colonial mentality of saying, you do this or I withdraw my aid, will definitely make people extremely uncomfortable with being treated like children." It is clear that top-down reform with the Western world leading the way is not going to be the road that Africans take to change their anti-LGBT laws. Skepticism towards the West and homophobia are far too closely intertwined. Rejecting pro-LGBT legislation is rejecting neo-colonialism and is in favor of African nationalism, self-determination, and self-worth. Unfortunately, African homophobia is a tricky mix of anti-neocolonialism, politics, and religion, made worse by the HIV/AIDS crisis. This crisis has led Africans to associate HIV/AIDS and death as a consequence for being gay, similar to American attitudes towards HIV/AIDS during the United States AIDS crisis of the 80s. So what is the future of LGBT rights in Africa? In many countries...
Who was part of that?
Go ahead.
Do you remember? You remember who was part of that AIDS epidemic thing? Starts with an F, particular doctor.
Yes, I do. And it's funny, glad you mentioned that, because it's funny, like, people are giving him praise now, and very quickly, we forget our history that he was not a fan of the gay community. I will say that. Yes.
Yeah. Worked with Dr. Drew during that. Dr. Drew got orders from that guy during that period of time.
Right.
And he talks about how terrible that was.
Right.
And how they should have done everything different.
So in many countries, despite the legacy of colonization, citizens are taking a more autonomous stance on LGBTQ plus legislature, with the queer communities taking the lead instead of external pressures from the West. Across the world, countries that have improved their LGBT rights records have done so because of the hard work, organizing, and leadership of local LGBT groups and communities, and the case of Africa is no different. Enforcing top-down change from the West would do little to change the attitudes of Africans towards homosexuality. This is a struggle that must be led by local LGBT communities who know best what they need and how to fight for it. So essentially kind of what we say. Right. It has to be a bottom-up approach. And I would argue, I think, as I've said on streams before, I think a lot of things, especially given social media, it is very sparse in Africa. It is extremely hard to get updated information. As I say, generally, Africa is usually 5 to 10 years behind of everyone else in terms of tech, in terms of information. So a lot of the ideas, and I think especially since religion is so ingrained in African culture that it's so intertwined and it's so fundamentalist, it is extremely hard for people to think differently outside of what they know from church, because that's basically all you do, especially if you live in the bush. You work, you go to school if you're lucky, and go to church. That's it. It's not like people in the bush are watching TV to kind of hear, or able to go online to kind of read or listen to different ideas. So that's what makes it very difficult. And especially given, and I said this with JB on that segment that we did with him a month ago, the median age, especially in Uganda, is 15. So it's very young, very impressionable. And a lot of these missionaries, and I could say that because once upon a time I was connected with these groups before I knew better. They are very impressionable, and they definitely, and many of the teachings, especially like church teachings, are often inaccurate. So they're getting a lot of wrong ideas, and they're implementing that in the churches with these essentially young people. So it's a lot of fair-based doctrine, and a lot of conformity to kind of do things the right way under the eyes of God. So anything that kind of counters that would be considered sinful, or, like to the point where, you could be, estranged from your family, or worse yet, killed, depending on the circumstances. So it's a lot of fear-based mentality in Uganda, in terms of, especially in terms of people who are in authority. So you do not question your leaders. You do not, unlike here where we kind of do that all the time. It's always expected that you do, generally, but over there is pretty much the opposite. Like, you accept anything that anyone in authority tells you, even if they're wrong. So it doesn't make for a good mix of having a sentiment, especially in terms of LGBTQ rights or anything of the sort. Is very hard to counter. So, it's hard, because, obviously you have to deal with a lot of red tape, as Leah said, in terms of politics and religion are so intertwined. But as she said, the way to do it is from the bottom up. But even that's tricky, just, because a lot of this stuff has to be done underground. Otherwise,
Karen in the chat. Wait, didn't Uganda find a lot of gold?
We're getting to that. We're definitely getting to that. We know you guys are smart, and but let's get into that. Because I actually, wait. Did I get this tweet before? No, there was a tweet before that. That I added.
Why doesn't it show up there? Okay, hold on. I'll go get it.
Yeah.
Well, let's do that. While I do that. Okay. Hold on, you're good.
Okay.
Keep talking.
So
you're good.
Yeah, actually, I'll just read it. So I saw this today, which made me mad. So our friend Marianne Williamson, she retweeted this issue from the New York Times, and she said, "Nothing is more dangerous than bigotry codified into law. What Uganda has done decriminalizing LGBTQ should be condemned by the entire world." So I kind of went off on her on Twitter, basically being like, and I didn't put it here, but basically saying a lot of that sentiment is due from the West and the church. So get your facts right. And then, yes, so this tweet is what Marianne kind of spilled out into the Twitter universe. And then shout out to I Am a Marxist for Life. He or she tweets back, "Don't worry too much, because the US will use this as an excuse to liberate that 17 trillion in gold recently discovered, but even you know this and are playing right into the Pentagon's hands." Marianne Williamson doing the work of the CIA. And,
gold.
I asked Reef specifically to fill that, at least that's one time. And one thing I do love about our Twitter and our community is that when all of this was going on, especially kind of reading everything, you guys are smart. You guys figured out, especially as I said earlier, the call for possible sanctions. Immediately, people were like, well, what resource do they have that would warrant them to pull the sanction card? And a lot of you said this already, and we've talked about this on the show before. And I'm going to pull this up.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So yeah. I
gotta go back.
a couple. Yeah.
Here it is.
There we go. So a lot of you guys are so smart. And a lot of you call this out. And I just pulled this article from Reuters. But Uganda says exploration results show it has 31 million tons in gold ore. So Uganda on Wednesday, so this was over the spring, I believe, said recent exploration surveys have shown it has gold ore deposits of around 31 million tons, and it wants to attract big investors to develop the sector hitherto dominated by small wildcat miners. Over the past 2 years, aerial exploration was done across the country, followed by geophysical and geochemical surveys analysis. Solomon Mutiba Buita, spokesman for the Ministry of Energy and Mineral Development, told Reuters. Buita said an estimated 320,158 tons of refined gold could be extracted from the 31 million tons of ore. But most of the deposits were discovered in Karajoya, a parched, sprawling area in the country's northeastern corner of the border with Kenya. Large reserves were also found in eastern, central, and western areas of the East African country. Butia said Wagai, a Chinese company, had set up a mine in Busia in eastern Uganda and was expected to start production this year. Gee, the plot thickens, Reef. Wagai had invested $200 million, he said, and its mine will have a refining unit. President Yoweri Museveni's government has been seeking to ramp up investment in mining to develop resources like copper, iron ore, gold, cobalt, and phosphates. Parliament early this year enacted a new mining law that, once signed by the president, will pave way for the creation of a state mining company. The company will compulsorily acquire a 15% stake in every mining operation, and investors will be required to sign a production sharing agreement with the government. Previously, investors were given mining production licenses on a first-come, first-served basis. So yes. So we've said this on the show. We've warned you guys about this. I remember even as early as in the fall that there was reports that Uganda had discovered gold, and I was like, you guys need to keep your big mouth shut because the U.S. will want it.
Mm-hmm.
And so this doesn't help any matters in terms of Museveni. And I'm going to be very fair. Museveni is shit. Like, if you think Biden is bad, I would argue Museveni is worse. He's very much the stereotypical African politician that you will think of in every way, and he definitely plays into the hand of a West way too much. I wouldn't be surprised if this is kind of a ploy for him to have America kind of step in terms of essentially seizing, their resources that, as, like China's already there making that investment. And now I believe this is just a hot take, by the way. Like, he's trying to be greedy and trying to get the West involved as well, so he can rack up the profit for himself and anyone close to him at the expense of his people. So I kind of feel like him really pushing this anti-gay sentiment in a way was on purpose in light of getting the West's attention. And it worked. So yeah, so like I said, I think we'll definitely continue to watch this story.
Yep.
Especially since I have a personal stake in this. And as I said, it pains me to kind of report a story like that, but just know from being on the ground, and this is something I'll say all the time, Ugandans, like at least the ones I met, are very sweet, very kind, and very loving people. And again, shout out to my friends and family, who I call family now, who have taken care of me, when I first lived there, and in trips since, have really shown me the love in terms of showing me their country, the hospitality that made me feel comfortable and at ease, living there and in visits since. So I don't want to have you guys think that this sentiment is across the board among Ugandans in general. It's just that there's a lot of issues in terms of religion that, unfortunately, as I said, is a fear-based environment that it's very scary to question people in authority just generally. So it's not, so this kind of sentiment, unless that changes, is not due to Ugandans having this thought. It's due to what has been placed in their culture just due to the colonization of Africa in general. So I do want to preface that this sentiment is not shared by the whole of the population, but rather, in a way, I feel compelled to share more because they're going to be in a position where they're going to be too afraid to speak up, due to their safety. So I feel on their behalf, I should.
Right.
In terms of sharing that this is not indicative of what the population might believe, even though some might, but many are willing to kind of think differently if they had the right resources and if their safety wasn't on the line. In terms of having a certain thought or calling this out may result in capital punishment, essentially, for them.